Racist cop punches black woman, then discovers she's a judge. A routine traffic stop takes a shocking turn when a racist police officer assaults a black woman, convinced she's powerless to fight back. Fueled by his arrogance and prejudice, he sees her as just another easy target. But what he doesn't realize is that this woman isn't just any civilian. She's a highly respected judge with the authority to hold him accountable. What happens next will leave him stunned and teach an unforgettable lesson about justice, respect, and the consequences of unchecked power. Before we dive into this powerful story, tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more impactful tales that challenge prejudice and inspire change. Stay tuned for a dramatic twist that will leave you questioning the true meaning of authority and accountability. The police officer's tone was sharp as he approached the car. "License and registration," he barked, shining his flashlight directly at the driver's face. His attitude made it clear he wasn't here to have a respectful conversation. Sitting calmly in the driver's seat was a black woman, composed and unshaken. She politely asked, "May I know why I was stopped?" Her voice was steady, confident, and respectful. The officer ignored her question, repeating, "License and registration," his tone growing more impatient. Without hesitation, she handed over the documents, her movements slow and deliberate. She had encountered situations like this before. As a judge, she had spent her career upholding the law, but she also knew that not everyone followed it as they should. "You were speeding," the officer said flatly, his words lacking any real conviction. The woman raised an eyebrow but maintained her calm demeanor. "I'm quite sure I wasn't speeding," she replied. "May I see the radar reading?" The officer's jaw tightened, his irritation becoming more visible. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" he snapped. "I didn't say that," she answered. "I just want to ensure everything is clear." Her response seemed to provoke him further. He leaned closer to the car window, the flashlight still shining. "People like you think you can get away with anything," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. She didn't react to his comment, keeping her expression neutral. "I'd like to know the reason for this stop," she said firmly but respectfully. The officer straightened up, his frustration growing. "I'm asking the questions here," he said coldly. "You're the one being pulled over, not me." She stayed silent, letting him continue. He glanced over her documents, his face tight with annoyance. "Where are you headed?" he demanded. "That's personal," she replied. "Is there a reason you need to know?" The officer's tone grew harsher. "You don't get to decide what's important here. Answer my question, or this will go a lot harder for you." She met his gaze calmly. "I've complied with your requests," she said, "but I'd still like to know why I was stopped." The officer's face reddened slightly, his authority feeling challenged. "You're testing my patience," he snapped. Her reply was simple and calm. "I believe it's my right to ask questions." The officer stepped back from the car, muttering under his breath. He looked her over again, as if trying to find a reason to escalate the situation. His demeanor showed he wasn't used to being questioned, especially by someone who carried herself with such quiet confidence. "Step out of the car," he ordered abruptly. Without arguing, she complied. She opened the door slowly and stepped out, standing tall and composed. The officer looked her up and down, his frustration evident. He assumed she would back down, but her calmness seemed to unnerve him. This wasn't her first time encountering someone like him. She knew his type: quick to judge, quick to assert power, and uninterested in listening. But she also knew that remaining composed was her greatest strength in situations like these. The officer's impatience grew as he demanded answers. She responded firmly but respectfully, never raising her voice, even as his tone became more condescending. He looked at her as if he had already made up his mind about who she was. But what he didn't know was that the person standing before him wasn't just another civilian. She was a judge, someone who had dedicated her life to the law, someone who understood power and accountability far better than he ever could. The officer didn't see it yet, but the power in this interaction wasn't his. And soon he would realize just how much he had underestimated the person standing in front of him. The officer's mocking tone echoed in the quiet night. Accountable? To who? You think you can waltz in here, throw around some fancy words, and suddenly I'm the one in the wrong. His sneer deepened as he gestured toward her car. Lady, I'm the law here. You don't get to tell me anything. She stayed composed, her gaze steady and unwavering. I'm not here to tell you anything, she said firmly. But I am here to remind you that the law applies to everyone, including you. He took a step closer, his arrogance palpable. You think you're clever, don't you? He said, leaning in slightly. People like you always think you're above the rules. People like me? She asked, her tone calm but pointed. What exactly do you mean by that? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he scoffed, waving her words away. You know exactly what I mean, he muttered under his breath. The woman didn't flinch. Years of navigating prejudice had taught her not to react to provocation. Instead, she asked, Is there a reason you're escalating this situation, officer? Escalating, he repeated, his voice rising. I'm not escalating anything. You're the one making this harder than it needs to be. She tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. I've complied with everything you've asked. I've remained calm and respectful. Yet, you've chosen to make this personal. Her words struck a nerve. His face flushed, and he took another step closer, his frustration spilling over. Don't try to twist this around, he snapped. You're not as innocent as you're pretending to be. Innocent of what? She asked evenly. You've yet to provide a valid reason for this stop, and now you're resorting to accusations without evidence. Her calmness only seemed to fuel his anger. You think you're smarter than me, don't you? He said, his voice low and threatening. You think you can talk circles around me and walk away like nothing happened. I don't think anything of the sort, she replied. I'm simply standing up for myself, which I have every right to do. The officer's fists clenched at his sides. He was clearly unused to being challenged, especially by someone who refused to lose their composure. You've got quite an attitude, he muttered, stepping back slightly. Maybe I need to teach you a lesson. A flicker of unease crossed her face, though her voice remained steady. What kind of lesson do you think I need? She asked. Don't test me, he growled, pointing a finger at her. You're already in enough trouble as it is. I'm in trouble, she asked, raising an eyebrow. For what? Asking questions, asserting my rights? For disrespecting a law enforcement officer, he snapped, his tone dripping with arrogance. Disrespect, she repeated. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't used offensive language. I've simply asked for clarification and stood my ground. If you see that as disrespect, perhaps the issue isn't with me. The officer's face turned bright red, his frustration reaching a boiling point. That's it, he said through gritted teeth. Turn around. You're under arrest. For what? She asked, her tone sharp but controlled. What charge are you arresting me on? For resisting an officer, he said flatly, reaching for his handcuffs. I haven't resisted anything, she said, her voice firm. And you know that. Are you calling me a liar? He shouted, stepping closer to her. I'm saying your actions don't align with the facts, she replied evenly. He didn't respond immediately, his breathing heavy as he tried to maintain control. Finally, he muttered, "Turn around, or I'll make you." She didn't move. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will, officer," she said quietly. "I suggest you take a moment to reconsider." Her words seemed to push him over the edge. Without warning, he grabbed her arm roughly, twisting it behind her back. She winced, but didn't cry out, her composure intact despite the pain. "This is what happens when you don't listen," he snarled, snapping the handcuffs onto her wrists with unnecessary force. As he pushed her toward the patrol car, she stumbled slightly, but quickly regained her balance. "You're making a mistake," she said calmly, her voice unwavering despite the situation. "Yeah? And what mistake is that?" he sneered. "Arresting someone who doesn't know when to keep their mouth shut." "No," she replied. "Underestimating the person you're dealing with." Her words gave him the pause for a brief moment, but his arrogance quickly returned. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he said coldly. "Just another loudmouth who thinks the rules don't apply to them." She didn't respond as he forced her into the back of the patrol car, the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her wrists. Her gaze met his in the rearview mirror as he started the engine, her calm expression unnerving him despite his best efforts to ignore it. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a small group of bystanders who had begun to gather during the altercation. "What was that about?" one woman asked, her voice filled with concern. "It didn't look right," another man replied. "She wasn't doing anything wrong." A young woman nearby shook her head. "He just lost his temper because she stood up to him," she said. "I hope she's okay." Inside the patrol car, the officer's frustration continued to simmer as he drove toward the station. He glanced at her through the mirror, his smirk returning as he said, "You're awfully quiet now. Running out of things to say?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I have plenty to say," she replied, "but I'll save it for when it matters." Her confidence unsettled him, though he quickly masked it with another sneer. "Keep talking," he muttered. "It won't change anything." She leaned back in the seat, her composure unshaken. "We'll see about that," she said calmly. The tension in the car was palpable as the station loomed closer. The officer believed he had won, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. The patrol car screeched to a halt in the station parking lot. The officer slammed the door as he got out, his frustration visible in every step as he yanked open the back door. "Out!" he barked, grabbing the woman by the arm and pulling her roughly from the car. She didn't resist, but met his aggression with a steady gaze. "Is this how you treat everyone you pull over?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. "You don't get to ask questions," he snapped, dragging her toward the entrance. "You're the one in cuffs, remember?" As they entered the station, a few officers glanced up from their desks, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to surprise as they took in the scene. One officer raised an eyebrow, clearly noticing the unnecessary force being used. The woman remained composed, even as the officer pushed her toward the booking area. "You seem very confident in your actions," she said evenly. "I hope you're prepared to justify them." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Justify what? Doing my job?" "If this is your idea of doing your job, you might want to rethink your career," she replied. His face reddened, his frustration boiling over. "You're really pushing it," he said through gritted teeth. "Am I?" she asked. "Or are you realizing that you've pushed too far?" The room grew quieter as a few officers and staff began to gather nearby, their curiosity piqued. The officer noticed the attention and straightened up, his tone growing louder and more defensive. "You think you're untouchable?" he sneered. You're just another civilian who doesn't know when to shut up." Her expression didn't change, but her words carried weight. "You've assumed a lot about me tonight," she said. "But assumptions don't make you right." He scoffed, gesturing toward the cuffs on her wrists. "And what makes you right? You think you're smarter than me just because you use big words and act calm. Newsflash, that doesn't mean anything here." "Calmness is a choice," she replied. "A choice you seem to be struggling with." His face flushed deeper, and he took a step closer. "You don't get to lecture me," he growled. "I'm the one in charge here, not you." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "That's what you think," she said quietly. Her words made him pause for a brief moment, but his arrogance quickly returned. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied simply. The growing crowd of officers and staff exchanged glances, their curiosity now tinged with confusion. One of them, a younger officer, stepped forward hesitantly. Is everything okay here?" he asked, his tone cautious. "Everything's fine," the older officer snapped, waving him off. "Stay out of it." The woman turned her attention to the younger officer, her voice calm but firm. "I'd like to know who's in charge here," she said. "I believe this situation has been mishandled, and I intend to address it." The older officer laughed harshly. "In charge? You're looking at him," he said, puffing out his chest. "And you're not addressing anything. You're in no position to make demands." "Demands?" she repeated. "I'm not making demands. I'm stating facts." Her words seemed to unsettle him, though he masked it with another sneer. "Facts don't matter when you're in cuffs," he said. "They will," she replied. "And so will accountability." The tension in the room was palpable as the onlookers shifted uncomfortably, their unease growing with each exchange. The younger officer glanced at the woman again, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, but he didn't speak. The older officer, however, seemed oblivious to the shifting atmosphere. "Enough of this," he said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward a holding cell. "You can talk all you want once you've had time to think about what you've done." She didn't resist, but turned her head slightly, addressing the room. "Is anyone here going to step in and stop this abuse of power?" The room fell silent, the question hanging heavily in the air. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. The older officer smirked, clearly taking the silence as validation. "See," he said, "no one's on your side." "Are you sure about that?" she asked. Her voice calm but firm. Her tone made him hesitate, but he quickly dismissed it, shoving her toward the cell. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" he muttered. "I am," she replied. "And here's one more." She turned toward him fully, her posture commanding despite the cuffs on her wrists. "I'm Judge Alexandra Turner," she said, her voice steady and authoritative. "And I'm the one responsible for overseeing misconduct cases like this one." The room went still. The older officer's face froze, his mouth opening and closing as he processed her words. "What?" he stammered. "You heard me," she said. "I'm a judge. And as of now, your actions are under scrutiny." The murmurs from the gathered staff grew louder, disbelief and shock rippling through the room. The younger officer stepped forward, his face pale. "Judge Turner," he said hesitantly, I didn't realize it was you." "You wouldn't have," she replied, "because your colleague didn't bother to ask. Instead, he chose to escalate a situation unnecessarily and violate the rights of the person he was supposed to serve." The older officer's face turned bright red, his arrogance replaced by panic. I didn't know," he stammered. "That's no excuse," she said firmly. "Your lack of awareness doesn't absolve you of responsibility." The tension in the room reached its peak as the onlookers stared at the officer. their expressions ranging from shock to disapproval. He took a step back, his confidence crumbling. "Judge Turner, I was just doing my job," he said weakly. "Your job," she repeated. "Your job is to uphold the law and treat people with respect, not abuse your power and make baseless arrests." The younger officer stepped forward again. "Judge Turner, I apologize for not stepping in sooner," he said. She nodded at him, her expression softening slightly. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step toward solving it," she said. Turning back to the older officer, her gaze hardened. "As for you, there will be consequences for your actions," she said, "and I'll personally ensure that justice is served." The older officer looked like he wanted to disappear as the weight of her words settled over him. The room was silent except for the sound of his heavy breathing. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and the arrogance that had once fueled him was gone. In its place was fear. Fear of accountability, fear of consequences, and fear of the woman who had shown him the true meaning of authority. The room remained eerily silent after her declaration. "I'm Judge Turner," she repeated, her voice steady and authoritative. The officers and staff in the room froze, their stunned faces mirroring the gravity of her words. The older officer stepped back, his smirk long gone. His face had turned pale, his lips struggling to form words. Judge?" he stammered, his arrogance replaced by sheer panic. You're a judge?" "Yes," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "Not that you bothered to ask before escalating this situation unnecessarily." The younger officer, who had hesitated earlier, stepped forward, his voice filled with regret. "Judge Turner, I had no idea," he said, his tone apologetic. She turned her gaze toward him, her expression softening slightly. "That's clear," she said, "but it doesn't excuse what I've experienced here tonight." The older officer was visibly sweating now, his bravado shattered. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The weight of what he had done was crashing down on him, and the realization of who he had assaulted was almost too much to bear. "You were so sure of yourself," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "So confident in your assumptions, so quick to act without thinking. And now that you know who I am, you're finally questioning your actions. Why did it take this revelation for you to reconsider?" "I didn't," he began, his voice weak. I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't care to know," she said sharply. "You assumed you had all the power in this situation, and you abused it without hesitation." The officers and staff in the room exchanged uneasy glances. The once arrogant cop now looked like a shell of his former self, his shoulders slumped and his face etched with regret. The younger officer cleared his throat, stepping forward again. "Judge Turner," he said hesitantly, "I'm so sorry this happened. It's not right, and it's not how we're supposed to operate." She nodded slightly. "Acknowledging the problem is a start," she said. "But acknowledgement without action means nothing." She turned back to the older officer, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about every person you've treated this way. Every individual you've intimidated, humiliated, or harmed because you thought you could act without consequence." His breathing was heavy as he shook his head, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. "I didn't mean to—" "Your job," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to abuse and intimidate. What you've done tonight goes against everything your badge stands for." She took a step closer, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "You targeted me because you thought I was powerless," she said. "You saw my skin color, my gender, and you made a decision based on your biases. But what you failed to see is that I'm not just one person. I represent every individual who has been mistreated by people like you. And I will ensure that your actions are held accountable." The tension in the room was palpable as her words hung in the air. The onlookers, who had once been silent, now began murmuring among themselves. Some nodded in agreement, their expressions filled with the newfound respect for the woman who stood before them. "Judge Turner." A sergeant stepped forward, his voice steady but apologetic. "On behalf of this department, I want to apologize for what you've experienced tonight. This is unacceptable, and we will ensure it's addressed." She met his gaze, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you," she said. "But apologies alone aren't enough. There needs to be systemic change to ensure this doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone." The older officer looked down at the ground, his hands trembling slightly. He had gone from arrogant and confident to defeated and humiliated in a matter of minutes. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. She regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Your apology doesn't erase what happened," she said finally, "but it's a start. What matters now is what you do moving forward." The sergeant nodded, stepping closer. "This will be thoroughly investigated," he said, "and disciplinary action will follow. You have my word." Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of the officers and staff who had gathered. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," she said. "Authority is not a license for abuse. Your badge is a symbol of trust, and it's your responsibility to uphold that trust every single day. If you fail to do that, you fail the very people you've sworn to serve." The room was silent as her words sank in. The younger officer stepped forward again, his expression earnest. "Judge Turner," he said, "thank you for handling this the way you did. You could have retaliated, but instead you chose to educate us." "That's something I won't forget." She nodded, a small but genuine smile appearing on her face. "It's not about retaliation," she said. "It's about accountability and change. And that starts with all of you." As she turned to leave, the sergeant approached her, his tone respectful. "Judge Turner," he said, "if there's anything else we can do—" "There is," she interrupted. "Make sure your officers receive proper training on bias, de-escalation, and accountability. It's not enough to say you'll do better. You need to prove it." He nodded. "Understood," he said. The older officer remained silent, his head bowed as she walked past him. The once confident man was now humbled, his arrogance replaced by the weight of his actions. As she stepped out of the station, the air felt lighter. She had faced countless challenges in her career, but tonight was a reminder of why she had chosen this path, to fight for justice, even when it wasn't easy. And while the night had been difficult, she knew it had sparked a necessary conversation. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. The next morning, the police department issued an official statement acknowledging the incident. The officer in question was placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation, and the story began spreading rapidly across social media. Videos of the incident, captured by bystanders, went viral, sparking outrage and widespread discussion. The footage showed everything: the officer's aggressive behavior, his dismissive tone, and, most strikingly, the moment when the woman calmly revealed her identity as a judge. Comments poured in from people across the country. "She handled that with so much grace. She's an inspiration," one commenter wrote. Another added, "This is exactly why systemic change is needed. People in power must be held accountable." The judge, however, stayed focused on the bigger picture. When approached by reporters outside her chambers, She didn't dwell on the humiliation she had endured. Instead, she spoke about the importance of addressing the root causes of such incidents. "This isn't about one officer or one mistake," she said during a press conference. "This is about a culture that allows unchecked authority to thrive. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their race, gender, or background, feels powerless in the face of prejudice." Her words resonated deeply, sparking conversations in communities, workplaces, and schools about bias, respect, and accountability. Many people praised her for using the incident as an opportunity to advocate for change rather than seeking personal revenge. The officer, meanwhile, faced not only disciplinary action, but also public backlash. As more details emerged about his history of complaints, the pressure mounted for the department to take decisive action. Local organizations called for increased transparency and mandatory training for all officers on de-escalation and bias awareness. 1 week later, the judge was invited to speak at a town hall meeting organized by community leaders. The room was packed with people eager to hear from her directly. As she stood at the podium, her calm and composed demeanor commanded the room. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she began, her voice steady. "But it starts with accountability. It starts with each of us examining our biases, speaking out when we see injustice, and demanding better from those in positions of power." She shared her own journey, how she had faced discrimination throughout her life, how it had shaped her, and how it had driven her to become a judge. "I didn't pursue this career for power or prestige," she said. "I chose this path because I believe in justice. And justice begins with treating every individual with dignity and respect." Her words were met with applause, and many attendees expressed their gratitude for her leadership. "You've turned something terrible into something meaningful," one man said. "You've given us hope." The incident also inspired others to share their stories. People began coming forward with similar experiences, their voices adding to the growing demand for reform. The judge listened to each account, offering words of encouragement and promising to use her position to advocate for systemic change. Back at the police department, the atmosphere had shifted. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to misconduct were now reflecting on their own actions. The sergeant who had apologized to the judge took the lead in organizing mandatory training sessions for the entire force. "We owe it to our community to do better," he said during a meeting. "This isn't just about one mistake. It's about ensuring it never happens again." The officer who had caused the incident remained silent, his career in shambles. He submitted a written apology to the judge, acknowledging his actions and the harm they had caused. Though she read the letter, she chose not to respond directly. "Accountability isn't about me accepting his apology," she explained to a colleague. "It's about him recognizing the impact of his actions and committing to change." The judge's decision to focus on reform rather than retaliation won her widespread admiration. People from all walks of life reached out to thank her for standing up, not just for herself, but for others who had faced similar injustices. "I hope this incident reminds people that everyone deserves to be treated with respect," she said in an interview. "And that authority is a responsibility, not a privilege." The story continued to gain traction, sparking national discussions about police reform, implicit bias, and the importance of holding those in power accountable. Advocacy groups used the incident as a rallying point, pushing for changes in policies and training programs across the country. For the judge, the experience was a reminder of why she had chosen her career in the first place. As she returned to her courtroom, she carried with her a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced prejudice and injustice head-on, and she had emerged stronger, more determined than ever to fight for a fairer, more equitable system. In the weeks that followed, she received countless letters and messages from people inspired by her actions. One message, written by a young woman, stood out. "You've shown me that staying calm and standing firm can make a difference. Thank you for being an example of strength and grace." The judge smiled as she read the message, her heart filled with hope. While the journey toward justice was far from over, she knew that every step mattered. "Respect and accountability are not optional," she said during a later interview. "They are the foundation of justice, and it's up to all of us to ensure those foundations remain strong." As the story faded from the headlines, its impact continued to ripple through the community and beyond. The judge's courage and composure had turned a moment of injustice into a catalyst for change, reminding everyone that even in the face of prejudice, grace and integrity could prevail. The story of the judge and the officer is a reminder that power doesn't justify abuse. Respect and accountability are the true foundations of justice. When authority is misused, it erodes trust and harms the very people it's meant to serve. Yet, this story also shows that change is possible when we confront injustice with grace, strength, and integrity. Now, let me ask you, have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? How did it make you feel, and what would you have done in that situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your experiences can inspire others to take a stand for what's right. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more impactful tales that challenge prejudice and celebrate resilience. By sharing these stories, we can amplify the message that fairness, respect, and accountability are non-negotiable. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey toward a better, more just world. See you in the next story, where we uncover more truths that challenge, inspire, and unite us all. Remember, change begins with each of us. Let's continue to work toward a world where respect and justice prevail for everyone.